first feature, I think, of the way we've tended to look, and I'm including myself in this kind of criticism really, the first feature of how we've tended to look at Dante's theology is that actually, in general, when we think about the context in which Dante operated, we have a kind of, our methodological move tends to be to look at the context through the lens of the text, through the lens of Dante's works. So you read Dante's work, you find a particular idea or feature in it, and then you look for corroboration elsewhere. Right? Partly this is a product of the way in which the Middle Ages tends to be taught in relation to Dante studies, so that most Dante scholars arrive at their understanding of the context through Dante's text. Okay? And what this means is that we tend to skew, I think, the context in which Dante was operating quite radically. I think that some of the most interesting readings that I've come across recently of Dante's works have shown how, if you take seriously the context in a way without looking at it through the lens of Dante's works, you actually reveal an awful lot about the sort of hidden dialogues that Dante is establishing, the things that he ignores, the things that he chooses not to talk about. But that hasn't tended to be the dominant mode in which we've approached this question. Secondly, also a point about context, I guess. When we think about Dante's theology, we've tended very much to examine the theological context that Dante is engaging with as though it was an inert set of texts and ideas. I've been guilty of using grand phrases like the theological tradition, okay, when I'm writing about Dante's engagement with theological ideas. But what we tend to do is to divorce the theology that Dante would have experienced and thought about and engaged with from any particular time and context, time and place. In part, this is driven by a very sensible consideration, which is the fact that Dante did this very annoying thing of going into exile at a certain point in his life, which means that it's really hard to figure out exactly where Dante would have been at particular moments when he was writing particular stuff. So it's quite hard to figure out exactly what he would have read and experienced at particular points. And because we can't pin down a single, if you like, milieu for Dante, we've tended to sort of point to a general mindset, a sort of medieval mindset that we think Dante might have engaged with. This is something that this project really tries to work against. Okay? I'm not suggesting that we try and go down a naive route of trying to figure out exactly what Dante would have read and when, as though that would reveal something inherently useful or interesting about his own thinking and writing. But I am suggesting that the absence of a clear-cut context has meant that we've possibly been too casual in thinking about Dante's context. In particular, in thinking about the things I've already mentioned, the cultural, social, intellectual conditions in which theological thought was encountered, the forms, the milieu in which theology was experienced, and how those forms might have intersected. So we took the decision, which perhaps not everyone would agree with, but we took the decision not to get into a flap about the idea or the fact that Dante went into exile and therefore moved out of the particular Florentine context, and to say, actually, it's a really useful exercise just to take this 20-year period, the 1280s, the 1290s, more or less the time when Dante, by his own account, in the Convivio, was studying among the Florentine schools where he would have encountered theology, and to take this particular context very seriously. Given that one of the fundamental principles, as I see it, of Dante's poetic practice in the comedy is his willingness to experiment, to draw together registers, modes of expression and thought, in ways that, at least in the literary sphere, are pretty radical. I think this idea of taking a particular time and place and seeing the intersections and the relationships between different forms of religious and theological experience is really crucial. So there's this important point about context to be made, the precise context. The third feature of studies of Dante's theology that I think has tended to dominate is that we've tended to focus a lot on content, on what Dante believed, which point of doctrine, his theological allegiance is as a consequence of this. Is he a Thomist? Is he an Augustinian? Etc., etc. This is something which absolutely, when you look at the scholarly editions of Dante's works, okay, those often quite intimidating scholarly editions of Dante's works, we find an awful lot of. Okay. Which position in which great thinker is Dante either agreeing with or disagreeing with at a particular moment? Now, I'm perfectly willing to accept that that's a valid thing to study. In fact, I think it is a really important thing to study. But what I've found quite revealing over the last few years as I've been thinking about Dante's theology is that I've tried as much as I can to talk to actual theologians about Dante. And at least the ones that I've chosen to listen to have told me that what they're really interested in is not so much what Dante believes about particular points of doctrine, but rather the way in which he expresses his theological thought. The fact that he develops a groundbreaking, daring mode of theological expression which is as rich in linguistic and literary experimentation as anything that you could imagine. And this chimes in many ways with contemporary debates around the form, the linguistic turn within theological studies. Those debates were also, of course, just as current in the Middle Ages. So what I'm trying to put forward, I suppose, is an approach to Dante's theology which takes its context seriously, in its own right, which doesn't use the comedy as a lens for some abstract theological tradition, but rather takes a particular time and place in a fairly concentrated way, and is as concerned with the ways in which theology is experienced and expressed as with the content. And I'll hopefully add a little bit of flesh this evening to what I mean by that and why I think this might be a useful way to approach this question. As my title tonight suggests, I think really this manifests itself in three very closely connected ways. First of all, the relationship between Dante's theological thought and his poetry, which is, of course, for those of you who know the Dante scholarship, it's an old chestnut of a question, but it remains absolutely crucial. Secondly, in the ways in which the practice of theology might shape religious experience and affect religious experience. And finally, in the relationship between theology and its social context. You'll notice, and this is one of those moments where I really do feel like I'm letting you in to show you how the sausages are being made. I'm not defining theology at this point for these purposes. This is not because I'm taking the category of theology for granted. Okay? I'm very clearly aware that the notion of theology is not something to be taken for granted, whether in the medieval context or even today. Theology could and does mean very different things, often contradictory, not always seen as compatible. But I am bothered that if we try and pin down too tight a definition of what Dante means by theology, how he sees it as a particular mode of thought or within his own thought system, then we neglect some of these more interesting, or not more interesting, but these important questions around the ways in which theology is actually expressed and experienced. I think if I could sum up some of these thoughts that I've begun with, I would do so within a single overarching consideration, which is, I found it hard to find a single phrase to really express this, but the phrase that I've come up with is around the location of theology, And what I mean by this is the idea that medieval theological language needs to be understood not only as making particular statements about the nature of God, but is always situated in, reflects upon, and manifests the relationships between God, human beings, and the world. The contemporary theologian David Ford has quite a useful way of thinking about this. He talks about the moods of theology. The term he uses is the moods of theology. And what he means by this is not so much, good and bad moods, although that might sometimes be appropriate. He points out that we tend to think of theology as operating in a grammatically indicative mood, stating realities. This is the nature of God, the Trinity. This is incarnation. Or else in a grammatically imperative mood, as a consequence of these truths, behave in this way, don't behave in that way. And I did the thing that I always tell students not to do, but I went to look just yesterday actually at a dictionary definition of theology, and I came up with this from Webster's, which is that theology treats of the existence, character and attributes of God, his laws and government, the doctrines we are to believe, and the duties we are to practice. And I think this in a way sums up what David Ford presents as a too simple understanding of what theology actually does. Because as Ford points out, I wanted to say just on that last point really, that you can see how so often the comedy itself lends itself to that kind of interpretation. And often when you read accounts of the theology of Dante's comedy, you find it described as a didactic text that aims to communicate certain ideas that Dante has about the nature of reality, and that also aims to teach us how to behave by the lessons that it gives us in terms of the punishment and reward in the afterlife. I mean, there certainly is that dimension to this, but there's actually much more going on than that in terms of, if you like, what the theological discourse of the comedy is actually doing. There are, David Ford points out, other moods which theology can take. He talks about the interrogative mood, the ways in which faith can be disturbed through questioning, back and forth of the quaestio format. He talks about the mood of longing and desire, a wish that things might be a particular way. He talks about a subjunctive, a more hesitant mood. This may be the way things are. There are interesting manifestations of some of these things, for example, in the ways in which medieval theological language can sometimes tend towards an apophatic mode where negative language about God is seen as the necessary response to human limitation, and also as a possible route towards understanding of God. There are also celebratory moods within theology, doxological, where praise becomes the dominant mode. And what I think is really valuable about this idea of mood, the moods of theology, is that it's an important expression of some of the ways in which theological and religious language in the Middle Ages doesn't just contain theological ideas or express those ideas, although it can do both, of course, but rather language is seen, theological language is seen to embed and manifest within itself some of the conditions within which they function. They aspire to speak of eternal truth which is beyond full human understanding. They aspire to speak of the grounding of everything that exists. But in other words, in doing so, they're not speaking of some neutral truth that's out there. They're always implicated within that which they are describing. Now, for me, in my own research on Dante, this became most clear in the ways in which one form of religious discourse operated within Dante's text and also within medieval culture. And that form of discourse that I've worked on most is in the liturgy. As I see it, liturgy, both for Dante and for medieval culture more generally, is a way of ordering language and action, time and space, in a manner which responds to what we're taking to be the fundamental truths about the relationships between God, human beings and the world. It's a negotiation between the conditions of human beings in time and space and the eternal truths with which they wish to engage. So one aspect of this is the way in which liturgy was presented as organising time. It was emphatically temporal, but also reshaped and broke the linear passage of time within the multiple repeated cycles of the liturgy, which drew together all of providential history, the life of an individual human person, the passage of a single day. And because of this, liturgical performance was important, as I say, not only because it claimed to represent divine truth, but also because it, if you like, embodied and reflected upon the conditions within which those truths were encountered. Liturgy, I think, is interesting also because it's emphatically an embodied mode of discourse and performance. An embodiment perhaps most fully evident in the sacraments, in many respects at the heart of the liturgy, conferring invisible grace by visible means, to use Augustine's frequently repeated formulation. The sheer difficulty of an encounter between an embodied human being and God receives particular attention in medieval analysis of the Eucharist, in which the bodily senses are both fully engaged in tasting, smelling, seeing the bread and wine, and yet also thoroughly confounded. This bread and wine which is tasted, smelled, seen is in fact not bread and wine at all, but the body and blood of Christ. The question then of the relationship between the experience in the here and now, in the material and temporal world within the body, and spiritual and eternal truth, is in many ways central to medieval understandings of liturgy. So this is a model which I think emerges really interestingly within Dante's own poem, and I think this leads me on to really starting to think a little bit about how Dante's poem can demonstrate or can manifest some of this. Because what I think it shows is how in many ways what's theologically interesting about the comedy is that it stages lots of different, it dramatizes, if you like, lots of different stages within the particular sets of relationships between God, human beings and the world. And the way in which liturgy functions within those relationships at those different stages. So to put it extremely crudely, in hell, liturgy is fundamentally, or basically, impossible, right? There is no liturgy in Dante's hell. You have parodies of the liturgy, you have negative versions of the liturgy, because this relationship between God and human beings is cut off, right? Francesca, the first sinner that Dante meets, says, if the King of the universe was our friend, we would pray for your peace. But she can't, right? A prayer is impossible because that relationship is cut off. In purgatory, you have a much more penitential mode, okay, reflecting the particular status and state of the souls in purgatory. They're gesturing towards the condition in which they're going to be able to praise God fully, but they're not there yet. Okay, so the liturgy serves to point up their particular condition in relation to God. And I've included just as one single example of this in quote A on the handout. An example, in fact, that I was talking about with some of the students here this afternoon, the sons of the gluttonous, who sing, Dante cites 3 words from Psalm 50, Labia mea Domine, O Lord, my lips. And this is, I think, interesting. It's interesting for lots of reasons. I think one of the reasons it's interesting is that it's an anticipation of praise, which doesn't quite get explained because the remainder of the line in Psalm 50 is cut off by Dante. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth shall show forth thy praise. But it's also interesting because it's precisely pointing back to the vice of which those souls are being purged, the vice of gluttony, okay, by referring to the lips of these souls. It's kind of, I guess you could think of it as a kind of joke by Dante at this point. And then the souls in paradise who, in this condition of union, in their condition of union with God, spontaneously utter praise. Okay, praise is by far the dominant mood of paradise, as a consequence of the particular relationship that the souls in paradise have with God, their situation within that relationship. So the comedy starts to become interesting because, not because it kind of teaches you certain things about the nature of God, but rather because it sets out and dramatizes different ways in which language and action can demonstrate and manifest different kinds of relationship between human beings, God, and the world. Okay, that's one of the things which I see as being valuable and interesting in the comedy. Another interesting example of this is the way in which the theological or the idea of the Trinity is discussed variously in the comedy. The Trinity is, in many respects, an idea which is absolutely everywhere in the comedy. It's kind of commonplace to say that. The rhyme scheme manifests it, or is thought to, said to represent it. It's an idea that is described at various points. But what I find quite valuable about, again, about the way in which the comedy presents the idea of the Trinity is it doesn't just give you a treatise about the Trinity, but rather it demonstrates the different ways in which language about the Trinity can work at different points and different stages in the journey. So, for example, the first place in the comedy where the idea of the Trinity is explicitly described is in the inscription above the gate into hell. Okay, where the words above the gates, quote, "Be tellers, Justitia mosse il mio alto fattore, fecemi la divina potestate, la somma sapienza il primo amore." Okay, so we have the idea of the three persons in the potestate, the sapienza and the amore. Okay. Now, it's absolutely normal in the footnotes to this section of the comedy to read this as a reference to the Trinity, and that's fine. But in many ways, actually, at this point in the comedy, I think it's fair to say that this doesn't really tell you very much about the Trinity. It doesn't tell you how it is that these three persons actually create, okay, which is in many respects actually the fundamental idea about the Trinity that Dante wants to engage with as you move through the poem, right? At this point in the poem, it just simply tells you that there are three persons, which actually, theologically, isn't really saying very much at all. Then in Purgatorio, Virgil, interestingly, problematically, because he is Virgil and therefore oughtn't to know all that much about Christian theology, uses the Trinity as an example of something which is beyond human understanding and tells Dante that you're mad if you think that human reason can reach the end of understanding the nature of reality, the way in which God, quote, "si tiene una sostanza in tre persone," and he says, you know, be contented, human people. If you could have seen everything, there was no need for Mary to give birth. Okay, so Virgil's really presenting the Trinity as something that just simply cannot be understood. He understands that the incarnation in some way is a way to understand the Trinity or to engage with the Trinity, but he's presenting this in a fairly negative way. But when you get into Paradise, the Trinity is talked about much more, but crucially, it's not only talked about, it is in a sense manifested. Okay, so giving you quote D as an example, these are the souls of the wise in the heaven of the sun, who don't just talk about the Trinity, but actually perform it. Qual uno e due, tre che sempre vive e regna sempre, in tre in due e uno non circonscritto, tutto circonscrive, sorry. Tre volte era contata di ciascuno, etc., etc. So the souls are not just talking about the Trinity, but they're actually manifesting it. And then at the moment when Dante the pilgrim, as well as Dante the poet, actually most explicitly describes his view on the Trinity, you have a really interesting, I think you have a really interesting sort of slippage or change in mood, to go back to David Ford's term. So this is Dante's response to St. Peter, questioning of faith, and Dante responds in a term which is often, in a set of phrases which is often described as Dante's creed. Io credo in uno di Dio solo ed eterno che tutto il cielo muove. Goes on and on, says why he believes in one God, and then 9 lines into that quote, e credo in 3 persone eterne, queste credo una essenza siula e si trina che sofferra giunta sono ed este. Okay, I believe in 3 eternal persons, and these I do believe to be one essence. Now this is a fairly explicit statement of Dante's understanding of the Trinity, and there's lots of interesting things that I won't go into about the way in which he actually arrives, or says that he arrives at that understanding, in terms of his use of a very scholastic language, but also that scholastic language used very much in terms of building his understanding from Scripture. Okay, there's quite an interesting mixture of discourses going on here. This sounds very much like a simple statement of belief in that theological indicative mode. But what happens very shortly afterwards, as we move through this section of the poem, this is the heaven of the fixed stars, is that we move from this statement of what the Trinity is and how the Trinity, or what the Trinity is and how Dante arrived at understanding it, to a mode where actually the poetry and the souls in Paradise turn to praise, and they sing praise of the Trinity. This follows directly the moments when Dante's just met Adam, but also Dante has explained and discussed the ways in which the condition of creation is in itself a manifestation of the power of the Creator. And the souls in Paradise utter a song of praise to the Trinity, which utterly wraps up Dante and lifts him out of himself into a condition described as drunkenness. So al Padre, al Figlio, al Spirito Santo, this is quote F, cominciò gloria tutto il paradiso, che sì che mi inebriava il dolce canto, ciò che io vedeva mi sembrava un riso dell'universo, perché mia ebbrezza entrava per l'udire e per l'uviso. So the statement about the Trinity very rapidly moves into a condition of praise of the Trinity. And there are lots of interesting phrases in there. In particular, I like the idea of un riso dell'universo, the idea of a smile of the universe, as a kind of, I see this as almost Dante seeing the universe delivering itself back to its creator in this moment of praise, where the language becomes a sort of spontaneous expression, if you like, of its recognition of its condition as created. So that I hope sets out some of the ideas about, or gives an example of the way in which the